Hello everyone, my name is Lidia Ardanova. I studied philosophy in St. Petersburg State University in Russia. And here in Cyprus, I'm doing my PhD, and it's a research in the Cypriot poetry of Renaissance of the 16th century. And this is our second meeting of series Literature, Art and Technology. And today we are going to talk about language and power. And we will see that language is a very powerful weapon, and maybe the best weapon of soft power, and that the future is in the hands of those who master the language. And in our previous episode, the previous time, we talked a bit about what is art, what is technology, and we said that art and technology, they are dialectically bound. That is, there is always some art in technology and some technology in art, and we said about the difference between them, and we said that technology reveals instrumentality. That is, technology reveals new and new ways to achieve goals, while art, it reveals ourselves, our inner selves, our hopes and dreams, and so on. And also we defined the phenomenon, contemporary phenomenon of social technologies, and I defined three kind of social technologies, which are digital in their social dimension, that is communication, then capitalist or consumerist, and political technologies. And all three tend to become the technologies of control. And from the mental or intellectual point of view, as I said, social technologies are based on repeating or reproducing the same discourse. And I will pay a lot of attention to this term today. We'll see in details what it is and how it functions. Social technologies are based on reproducing the same order of things. And then I said that it is in poetry and in art and literature is also art as art of word. So it's in poetry and art that we are bringing language from its routine use back to ourselves. And today I will try to describe the very basics of how language constitutes our reality and how we can interact with language in our relation to power, and precisely political power. And here I must put a disclaimer for today's particular lecture that it was very much inspired and influenced by a Russian philosopher and politologist, Maria Rachmaninova. So for those of you who know Russian, I strongly recommend to find her lectures online. They also exist on YouTube, and find her books and get to know them. So in the major part, I will transmit her ideas and elaborate them a little bit. What role the language plays in our everydayness, in our everyday life? Very often we are not aware about this role, and we don't contemplate on that. We are busy, we are in a hurry, and we simply use the language in order to communicate with others. And we don't think about what language is, we just use it. But what is the language? And let's take a closer look at it from the very beginning of the development of human species. And so, from the very start, in prehistorical times, by the end of Lower Paleolithic, that is the Old Stone Age, which ended at around 300,000 years ago, it happened that in human species developed the so-called articulation system. That is a transformation of the larynx, and the head took its vertical position, and all the organs of the mouth and the larynx developed so that they could produce what we know now as speech, that is articulation of certain meanings or representation that represent the world around us. And it's more or less the language as we know it today. So since then, the human became the first and the only creature on the planet who never, not anymore since then, lived fully, completely in nature, in the reality of nature. And what began developing instead of nature was the artificial symbolic reality, or the reality of language. And what does it mean? It means that in this reality, human does not live anymore among the objects of the world, but lives within his interpretation of these objects. I'll write this word. It's interpretation. So when we speak, when we use language to interact with things, it's our comprehension and conceptualization, not the actual objects. And since then began the artificial way for the human and not completely natural. And this way led us further and further towards the appearance of second symbolic dimension, our history. And in the period from 800 to 300 BC, it's so-called Axis Age. It's a term used by a German philosopher, Karl Jaspers, in the sense of pivotal age to characterize the period of ancient history when the first great civilization emerged in Greece, in China, in India, in Palestine, and Iran. And these civilizations, they took different directions of development, but the common feature for all of them was the search of an answer for the question, what is a human being? So we may say in a way that civilizations start from this fundamental question, what is a human being, who we are? And they gave different answers to it, but the question was common. And in fact, this question is something that distinguishes us from the nature, because the other animals, as we suppose, at least this is what we know, they are not problem to themselves. They exist in nature like water in water. They are dispersed. They don't they are not a problem to themselves. And human asks, what is a human being? Who am I? And this way, human is a problem to himself. So if you consider that, you will realize that if you look around, you will see that we live in a reality that is almost completely artificial. Like everything around us, these walls and windows, this desk and our clothes and our haircuts and our shoes and of course our screens and cameras and everything. All these are some projections of human mind. They are some artificial constructions that emerge in a consciousness first, and then they become material. We produce them. And they don't exist, all these objects, all these things, they don't exist in the same way as natural things like trees or animals or anything else in nature. And all these things, they are products of our mind. It's our creation. And sometimes it's even funny to hear some evocations to something natural, even something as simple as natural beauty. So I say that it's natural beauty and this is not natural beauty. But in fact, no beauty is natural, because beauty is a category with human mind. And it's our judgment that something is beautiful and, or something is not. And in nature itself, there is no such category. Or even more complex example, when some people say that this is natural for a man or this is natural for a woman, and they should follow certain patterns of behavior because it's natural to them. But, well, here is a serious objection that for human nothing is completely natural, because we live in this world of interpretations of reality. And so yes, instead of the wild nature, we live in language, and I hope I was able to explain it. So on the one hand, we are the inhabitants of language, and on the other hand, is its agents. And what does it mean? It means that we transmit it. we inhabit it, we live in it, like we are born into it, and then we reproduce it, we transmit it, or we are the way that the language exists and functions. So how does the language functions? And here I will come closer to the explanation of the term discourse. Discourse. And probably many people heard this term and maybe thinking that it's just some snobbish way to talk about things, that it doesn't really mean anything. It's just a way to show that you know something while you don't know anything. And I heard such opinions that why you use such complicated terms if you can simply say like a talk or a conversation. But I will explain that it's a very important and meaningful concept. So to define what is discourse, we first it's good to define a smaller entity that belongs to it, because it's a complex notion, and the smaller entity that belongs to it would be a category. A category. It's something smaller than the discourse, and then in the discourse there are many categories. It consists of categories. And Maria Rachmaninowa defines it as following, the category. The category is a meaningful generalization of some idea or some phenomenon, or of the group of ideas and phenomena. And a classic example, the simplest example, when we say table, we don't mean, we may mean particular table, but we can use it in an abstract way, just to say about all the tables in the world, no matter their size and shape and color. And so we mean certain idea of that can be called like tableness, or this kind of Platonic idea of a table. And so the category captures the essence of a thing, allowing us to unite things of one kind into one word, one meaning. And even more, it works with the categories that capture not the objects, but some mental constructions. For example, freedom. Freedom is a very complex mental construction. And what is freedom? How can we define it if it's something that we cannot touch, we cannot feel it, it's not an empirical object. We can only think of freedom, we can imagine it. And so when we say freedom, we suppose a certain construction in our mind, which may mean usually a certain set of powers in society, or certain position of authorities, or certain idea of justice, and so on. And altogether, it's quite a complicated thing that, as we suppose, no animal is capable of imagining. And to make it even more clear, I'll bring an example. If, for example, a cat walks into the room and encounters different objects on her way, like a chair, a table, anything else, a cat sees it as a unique object, unique event that appears when they pass it, and then it disappears when it passes by. So it's like a standalone thing. They don't unite things that they encounter in categories or ideas. And here we can bring a parallel with how some people vote on elections. Because if people don't possess categories, if they don't think in terms in categories, they see, when they go and vote on elections, they see every particular candidate in such a way as a unique event, a unique figure, and they may like them for different reasons. For example, as they think someone is more attractive, or nicer, or more honest, as it seems to them. And when people don't categorize them, they don't inscribe them into a certain system, political system, they confuse the social reality with the nature reality, and they react to it just as if it was nature with particular objects unique objects, but it's not like that. And so it was an example to illustrate how language allows us to see that our thinking process is structured by categories. So language is even broader meaning. So language. Structured by discourse, and discourse is structured by categories. So we need categories
without the language without the no.
Indeed. It often happens that we say, like, the one who makes shoes goes without shoes. No, I know how it's how it should be spelled, but okay, thank you. And so the language allows us to see that our thinking process is fully structured by categories. And when it's not structured, things seem blurred, unclear, or too complicated to understand what's going on. And as we've seen with the example of elections. And here we'll also see something else, that language is not simply a number of categories that fly freely in some intellectual space. Language is a system. And this system is objective. It exists independently from us. What does it mean? Here I will refer to the book, which is very well known, and it's a great basic book on this subject. It's Social Construction of Reality by Berger&Luckmann. And this book was first published in 1966, and there are many interesting observations concerning the relation of language and power. In particular, it says that science and science systems are objectivations in the sense of being objectively available beyond the expression of subjective intentions here and now. In other words, there are particular situations, but in these situations we still refer to some stable entities of language. For example, if we talk about road signs are objective. They exist regardless to our particular case or situation when we see them, so that even when we stop seeing them, and even if we cease to exist, there will be other people who will use them. And the same goes for the units of language, words, phrases, gestures, and so on that exist objectively, while we embed ourselves into them and use them, performing particular language operations in particular situations. Then we leave the situations, but these units, the figures of language, are stable. They continue to exist, and they are used by other people in multiple numbers of their particular situations. And this way, language is an objective reality. And this is why Berger and Luckmann say, I encounter language as a facility external to myself, and it is coercive in its effect on me. Language forces me into its patterns, and in this manner, symbolism and symbolic language become essential constituents of the reality of everyday life. I live in a world of signs and symbols every day. We can imagine a certain field or sphere that we enter. This way we enter social, economic, and political formations. For example, capitalism. We are born into it, we grow and learn, and we embed ourselves into this algorithm of production relations. And we cannot change it, globally speaking. We can only choose our way to react to it, to interact with it, building the path of our life. In exactly the same way, we enter the language and interact with it, while language is objective and forces us to perform certain actions. And as Russian linguist Makarov says, he says the following. Communication is not an exchange of information as it seems. We don't exchange information when we talk. But then what do we do? Being embedded into the system of language, everyone in our personal way, we activate certain segments of the system. And this way we make certain events happen in the world. This is how we affect it. In other words, the way in which we personally, subjectively are embedded into the objective language influences. In the objective language influences the consequences of our usage of the language. And this is why language is performative. It means that it transforms the reality. It doesn't simply pass a message from the sender to the recipient, but it shapes the world. It affects the way the world will be seen. The way we communicate, the way we enable certain segments of language, it affects how everything will be around us. And we can bring an example here, and again, and the perfect example is children and teenagers, how they learn to master language. Very often the adults blame children and teenagers that they speak bad language, they use it in the wrong way, but they don't blame the system of language itself. When a child learns to speak, it doesn't simply learn new words, and as I mentioned before, words are bounded with categories to let us capture the world mentally. So the categories that the child uses to capture the world, they define the way this child will see the world and think about it. Category is not simply a word, it is a code that carries a certain message. And another example here can be racism. Some words are just stigmatized so that they force us to perceive another person in a negative way, even before we get to know. And so here we face the fact that the struggle for the language is a political struggle. It means that the way we see the reality, the way we think about the reality, will depend on the language that describes this reality. And this language can be changed. And since the language is performative, a change in a language will transform the reality. Political powers, generally speaking, fight for what? They fight for the monopoly, for the exclusive right to describe the reality in a certain way, to represent the world in a certain way. Because every political system represents the world through its own categories. If we take, for example, political discourse of the right wing, it is based on categories as hierarchy, tradition, authority, and such. And it's clear that if we think about it, for example, the current events in Belarus, we shall see it in one way, but if we use other categories to describe it, we shall see a different picture. And here we come closer to the understanding of what is the information war. Information war is a struggle for the right to describe the reality in a certain categories. And the struggle for describing reality in this or that way is the essence of political process. That's what it is. And here, eventually, we can better understand what a discourse is. When we talk about forces that are struggling to describe the reality in a certain way and suggest this image of reality as the best, as the only true and right way, we face the discourses, the struggling system of categories and their relations. And getting back to our example of political right-wing, we see that the right-wing discourse is not only right-wing parties and leaders or some other acting figures, it's everything that this discourse includes, that is a totality of rhetorics and also poetics, for example, heroic poetics and aesthetics, for example, certain preferences in clothes and haircuts. And all that will be a part of discourse. Not only language as a set of categories, but as a number of cultural codes, language of science forms, poetic language, and so on, shaping systems of science and material artifacts connected to them. So, well, as you see, discourse is what unites certain categories and relations between them, and the system enables certain processes. And this is how it is formed in the language, in this complex system of meaning. And now our goal will be to understand how the discourse functions and why it is important for us. And discourse itself produces and supports the systems of power. If in some discourse, for example, there is an idea of hierarchy, there we see a certain system of power, or the opposite. If it's the discourse of the anarchists, for example, we see no system of power. Or in some other discourses, there are several systems of power, and so on. And this way we approach a very important problem. How the system of power is possible? What is its foundation? In Aristotle, in his treatise Politics, we see where it comes from and how it develops in the language. Aristotle uses a category translated as a substance or essence. In Greek, it's ousia. And talking about slavery, Aristotle says, a slave has the essence of a slave who was supposed to be slave even before being born. And when being born, a slave lives a life of a slave. All his life is an expression of his essence and nothing else. And of course, it's something inappropriate for us now, but it's just an example. So for him, the essence comes first, and the expression of it comes after. And the same with the master. Master's essence is to be a master, so he lives a life of a master and expresses his essence of a master that pre-exists. And then in the history of thought, this idea was criticized by Marx in his 11th thesis on Feuerbach, and he says the famous philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways, but the point is to change it. Then what does it mean? How can we understand this thesis? How can we interpret it? And it can be explained that the philosophers have only grounded or gave foundations to the system of power, using some categories that make this power legitimate and clear. That's how things are, and that's we have to deal with it. And according to Marx, we should change it, not to deal with it, but change it. And well, we see that the discourse is founded on some categories of power, including the category of essence or nature. This way, we may still hear about women's nature, that is the nature of a woman to be that, as I said before, and such certain things, and many other examples. So let's proceed to the system of power. What is the system of power? How it works and how it differs from power in simple everyday meaning of the word. It is important to understand this to shape our political views, to answer what is our position in relation to the power. But in order to answer this question, we need to understand what is power. Very often people who criticize power, they use the rhetoric like there are some bad people in the government and we need to get rid of them and then everything's going to be fine. But the truth is that it's not like that, and it's a very superficial point of view. At least that's how contemporary philosophical and political analysis shows us. So what is a contemporary understanding of power? What it is? Many authors and thinkers thought about it, and one of the most prominent and probably famous was Michel Foucault. Probably heard of him. Anyway, it's Michel Foucault. And he studied the phenomenon of power his entire life. And he tried to give the definition of power, and he paid attention to the following thing. For example, in monarchy, the figure of king is sacred. It is supported by God and all the divine forces. And this form of power, it lasted the longest period of history, so far, till a certain moment. And it's interesting what changed this situation historically. Actually, and maybe unexpectedly, it is something connected to our actual reality, because what changed it was first a pandemic of leprosy and then the pandemic of plague. This is what Foucault says us, studying the history of culture. And these two pandemics, they happened mainly in Europe, and they began in the 14th century and they lasted till the 16th century. And these two pandemics forced humankind to search for some measures to cope with them. And the measures were the following. The way to cope were the two inventions, control and isolation. Something that we see developing today. Just like now, in order to stop the spreading of the disease, it was necessary to isolate the sick, the infected, and to control those who were not infected yet. Gradually, hence the instruments and methods of control were evolving. It shaped a new perspective, new understanding of what is power and how the power should be exercised. It changed everything. It changed the world, in fact. And also it changed the way of executions and punishment. It changed the way of how the criminals were treated. And it is very important for social reality. So if a monarch used punishment procedures to demonstrate his power, to cause fear and awe, then in monarchy, and then as we read in Foucault, the executions had to be rare, but spectacular and terrifying. And Foucault describes really, really terrifying tortures and executions, and you can read it in the book Discipline and Punishment. And then, after the pandemics and when control and isolation were applied, we see the change. And the monarch, as a source of power, was then replaced by such a thing as discipline. Because isolation and control are connected to the discipline. And then we see the rise of disciplinary power. Its goal is not to demonstrate the power, not to show the power of some sacred person, but to embed the power into every individual, inside the individual, to build it inside the consciousness. And we see the change in the system of punishment and execution. Now the purpose of execution is not to execute few people in the most spectacular and terrifying way, but to persecute many people and execute them in a hidden way. Or rather, not to persecute, but to prevent a crime. To create such condition that an individual would rather avoid committing a crime, would be afraid to do so. It is from this arise the modern global system of control, that hidden cameras, transparent walls, and keeping different tracks and records and so on. Or ideally, the idea was to create such situation that the individual would not like to commit a crime or some illegitimate action. There will be no, it will be not possible. And the system of governmental power that we live now, that we experience now, it's our reality. So today, power is not the power of a sacred figure, it's a power of discipline. And Foucault writes about it. The Enlightenment, which discovered the liberties, also invented the disciplines that secretly objectify the person under the jurisdiction. In appearance, the disciplines constitute nothing more than an infra-law. They seem to extend the general forms defined by law to the infinitesimal level of individual lives, or they appear as methods of training that enable individuals to become integrated into these general demands. And it's a quote from Discipline and Punish. So this is how the modern individual can be called a disciplinary individual. So that the establishment of control over the individual becomes something like natural continuation of the administration of justice that is saturated with the disciplinary methods and procedures of examination. This is the structure of governmental power. But here it is important that, as we remember from the above said, that power shapes discourses. And these discourses, they are peculiar to every particular system of power. So if we talk about power today, we talk about systems of power that are represented by some figure. And the source of power remains anonymous. It doesn't belong to any particular person, like in monarchy. It is a mechanism that functions by means of involving the individuals into it. All individuals who are involved in the functioning of power become its source. So we are all the source of power when we support the the existing discourse. So when the democratic rhetoric says that power belongs to people, it is true, and even if the actual regime is not as democratic as it is, but it is so necessarily. People are the source of power as long as they are embedded into discourse imposed by this power. Together with the governors, the people become the agents of power, and here the question that interests us is the question how they become involved. What happens that they become involved? It's not like someone comes and takes them by the hand and says, now you become an agent of power. No. In fact, all we need to do is to repeat, to reproduce the existing discourse. And as long as we do so, it doesn't matter if we criticize certain individuals in power or not. It doesn't change things. Because the discourse, the system of language that describes the reality will reproduce itself. And result then will be the same. And while being aware of this, we may consciously support the existing power if we like it, or if we don't like it and we want to change things, we need first of all to stop reacting to its rhetoric, to change the way we see things, the way we describe the reality. It may sound a bit too idealistic, but there are some particular methods, for example, as elaborated by Louis Althusser, who is a contemporary French neo-Marxist, and he's using the term interpellation. I will only refer to it and I will not give explanation further on. The most trivial conclusion will be if you want to change the world, you should start from yourself. But now, as we've seen all that in details, we see why it is truly so. You need to start from yourself, from the way you talk about things, the way you see things, and the way you react to the things. And this is how the power functions. And since the subject is literature and technology, we'll talk more about literature and what happens now with the rise of digital communication technology and with fast communication. What happens now with readers' behavior, so to say, and to illustrate the role, first of all, to illustrate the role of language. I will bring an example from literature and from the famous novel by George Orwell, 1984. In this dystopia, the totalitarian superstate named Oceania is ruled by a party who employ total surveillance and even thought police. And its totalitarian government is making a revision of the language, planning to entirely change the language to publish a new dictionary of newspeak that will serve the ideology of the state, not allowing people to think freely. It is a controlled language of simplified grammar and restricted vocabulary, designed to limit the individual's ability to think and articulate subversive concepts such as personal identity, self-expression, and free will. They just would not be able to do so because language will not allow them. And it's interesting that this way Orwell criticized the decline of language that he observed in his time. And Orwell's main objection of the linguistic decline is that it goes hand in hand with the decline of thought, the real possibility of manipulation of speakers as well as listeners, and eventually of the political chaos. And the recurring theme in 1984 is a connection between the unstable situation, authoritarian regime, and language is already found in his article Politics and the English Language. So he says that when the general atmosphere is bad, language must suffer. I should expect to find, and this is a guess which I have not sufficient knowledge to verify, that the German, Russian, and Italian languages have all deteriorated in the last 10 or 15 years as a result of dictatorship. He's talking about the events back in the beginning of the 20th century. But if thought corrupts the language, then language can also corrupt thought. So language is a powerful weapon, and the future of language, it depends on us. Well, to say even more about it, literature and technology in regard to our digital age, gadgets and communication, as I said, I will refer to an article by Adam Garfinkle, and he's an American publicist. The article is called The Erosion of Deep Literacy. And I will just read some passages from it. So Adam Garfinkle says that thoughtful people are realizing that the pervasive IT revolution devices upon which we are increasingly dependent are affecting our society and culture in significant but yet uncertain ways. We are noticing more in part because this technology is changing what, how and why we read, and in turn, how and why we write and even think. Harold Innis noticed in 1948, as television was on the cusp of revolutionizing American life, that sudden extensions of communication are reflected in cultural disturbances. And it's clear we are stumbling through another such episode. Such disturbances today are manifold, and as before, their most critical aspects may reside in alterations to both the scope and nature of literacy. As with any tangle between technology and culture, empirical evidence is elusive, but two things at least are clear. For one, new digital technology is democratizing written language and variously expanding the range of people who use and learn from it. It may also be diffusing culture. Music and film of all kinds are cheaply and easily available to almost everyone. In some respects, new digital technologies are decreasing social isolation, even if in other respects they may be increasing it. Taken together, these technologies may also be creating novel neural pathways, especially in developing young brains, that promise greater if different kinds of cognitive capacities, albeit capacities we cannot predict or even imagine with confidence. But it's also clear that through this, something has been lost. And in a book called Reader, Come Home, it was published in 2018, Marian Wolf used cognitive neuroscience and developmental psycholinguistics to study the reading brain and literacy development. And in doing so, it helps to identify what is being lost. So according to Wolf, we are losing what she calls deep literacy or deep reading. This does not include decoding written symbols, writing one's name, or making lists. Deep literacy is what happens when a reader engages with an extended piece of writing in such a way as to anticipate an author's direction and meaning and engages what one already knows in the dialectical process with the text. The result, with any luck, is a fusion of writer and reader with the potential to bear original insight. And deep literacy has wondrous effects, nurturing our capacity for abstract thought, enabling us to pose and answer difficult questions, empowering our creativity and imagination, and refining our capacity for empathy. It is also generative of successive new insight, as the brain's circuitry for reading recursively builds itself forward. And it is and does all these things in part because it touches off a revolution in the brain, meaning that it has distinctive and describable neurophysiological consequences. Understanding deep literacy is a revolution in the brain, has potential payoffs to understanding aspects of history and contemporary politics alike. So, when to summarize it, when we communicate with literature, that is deep, proper literature, we communicate with the system of language that does not only inform us, but it transforms us. It transforms the way we see the world and potentially transforms the world through us. And another aspect of it is that deep literacy enables not only complex abstract thinking, but also complex feeling or complex and fine emotions that we acquire from good literature and music. In other words, deep literacy allows us to feel pleasure in a richer and in a more luxurious way. In a certain way, literature is a school of emotional pleasure, and one of such pleasures is, of course, the feeling of freedom to create our future. And well, here I will finish and thank everyone for the attention. And well, for the closure, I will just wish to read good books, think deep, and act wisely, and see you in the next episode.